I needed a world for my characters to move around within. Even before it cuts to the story, most of my film was set in graveyards, so I knew I would need lots of tombstones. While I didn't need to use reference to create my characters, I didn't have a good internal concept of what a cemetery should look like. Fortunately, I happened to live within walking distance of one while I was working on modeling the world, so I was able to easily take some photos for reference. I ended up creating 10 different types of grave markers based on my reference photos, with additional variety created by altering colors and slightly modifying the dimensions. I also learned through my slight field research that an old, unkempt cemetery isn't laid out entirely in neat rows, but rather in clusters. Between 3 and 10 graves would be placed in rows near each other, with lots of open space between clusters. This informed the layout I used to put my gravestones into my scene, though this was also determined by the story. As for the other structures in my story, I didn't have access to cathedrals or mausoleums in my small town, so I took inspiration from elsewhere. I used images from the internet as the basis for the overall shape of the 2 mausoleums within this story, and stylized them to make them appear uneven and misshapen. Fans of The Legend of Zelda may also find another nod to this influential series in the design of the cathedral I built, though it is mostly not visible within the film, and I probably could have gotten away with a big concrete box. Trees and grass are fairly simple shapes, so I won't go into detail on how they were made. I will say, though, that to create the ground which the characters walk on, I placed a very large circle in the world and divided it into many smaller squares. I then used the points of these squares to manipulate the circle into an irregular surface with hills and valleys. While I had settled on cell shading for my characters, the world they would be moving through needed a bit more effort put into the materials that make it up. Within Blender, a material is the name given to the part of the model that makes up the colors that appear on its surface, and how that surface reacts with light. In the case of the cell shading I built, that system is a material. For everything else, it involves a blend of reflectivity, specularity, transparency, or alpha channeling, and texturing. I used different properties for different objects, so it wouldn't be useful to spend my time going through them all. I can talk about a few things with regards to textures, however. I developed most of the textures for my objects to appear like a stylized version of reality. I took photos of objects from around my apartment, like concrete sidewalks and grass, and ran them through a filter to create a blotch design that still conveys all the colors and textures of the original photo in a vague way. For the wooden textures, I used a brown color that I digitally painted, and then drew on black sharp lines to represent grooves in the bark using my drawing tablet. To create the moon, I used an equirectangular reverse panorama of the actual moon, which was released by NASA, and then ran it through similar editing filters to match the style of my other photographic materials. Upon the modeling, rigging, and material design of all the elements being completed, I was finally ready to begin animation. I finally had a full set of characters, a full set of props, and a full set. Technically, if I had rigorously storyboarded the entire film in advance, I could have planned my set around this, and only modeled the portions of it that would appear on camera. However, I wanted the freedom to be able to make changes during animation, and building a complete world with no blank spaces left for the camera or specific shots allowed me that freedom. To liken this to film, I was now playing the role of the director, choosing to shoot on location rather than building a soundstage so that I could create new shots or alter scenes based on the environment I had to work with. The difference here is that I also had the power to manipulate the ground, trees, and buildings to suit my purposes as well. To create an animation in Blender, you must create keyframes, specific points in time where you want an object to have a specific position, shape, color, rotation, etc. Frames are still images which, when viewed in rapid succession, create the illusion of movement. This concept is fairly universal at this point, with frames making up the images in cartoons, movies, videos on social media, video games, and pretty much every form of digital media with a video aspect. Keyframes are specific frames along the timeline, which serve the purpose I described previously. As for the frames in between keyframes, it is a luxury of computer animation that they are calculated automatically based on the keyframes you manually place. If you set a keyframe for an object on the ground at 1 second, and the keyframe for an object in the air a few seconds later, the frames in between will automatically show the object rising. Naturally, as a result, animation which hopes to show more fine details with smaller, more specific movements needs more keyframes than animation which only needs to show gross movements. I don't have a way to count the total number of keyframes I ended up creating for this film, but I know that in the over 4,000 frames I created, there must be more than 1,000 keyframes. In fact, because many keyframes must be placed to manipulate all of the objects which move through a scene, I wouldn't be surprised if I had as many keyframes as I had frames or more. Animation is typically played at around 24 frames per second, but because I was originally planning to animate Ghost by hand, I reduced my frames to 12 frames per second. This is why the film appears to have a choppy, stuttering look during some scenes. The goal was to emulate the appearance of stop-motion animation. Though if I could go back and redo things, I probably would have raised the frames per second back to 24. I started animating in the December of 2019 and made decent progress until I had to return to school at the end of January. My progress slowed to a near halt with classes and work taking up most of my time. I had 2 computers with the necessary software installed for animation, but unfortunately my laptop was not powerful enough to run my files in preview mode while all the models were loaded in. This further refined my time to animate to only when I was in my room and had access to my more powerful computer. I found time to animate during free time in the evenings and weekends once I had finished the assignments for my other classes. I steadily worked on animation through March, and I was finally able to complete the process during spring break. At some point between January and March, I realized that I would not have time to animate the ghost character by hand as I originally had planned. So I created a more advanced model for her, which gave me more control over the expressions her eyes could make and what direction they faced independently of her body. Both Ghost and Ghoul have cloth simulations, which allow for secondary movement in their body and hair respectively. These simulations needed to be fine-tuned and refined to match the speed and weight I needed, and while I had originally planned to use soft body physics for these simulations, this ended up being a process rife with glitches, so I replaced it with the slower and safer cloth simulation. For a cloth simulation to work, you must specify a group of vertices which will be affected by the simulation, and then determine how much weight this group places on each vertex within it, which is illustrated by a gradient resembling a thermal image. This group is known as a pin group, and in the context of a cloth simulation refers to the portions of the mesh you wish to remain still, while the vertices with a weight of less than 100% will move through the simulation proportionally. I used the same technique to create a brief sequence where a leaf flies past Ghost in limbo. By assigning proper weights to a leaf I modeled and running it through a cloth simulation, I was able to create a leaf that flew through the air, a sequence which I personally consider to be my favorite piece of animation within the film. I also incorporated several particle systems into my animation. A particle system is a tool within Blender that can be used to render a large number of objects in seemingly random locations, and can be altered to allow these particles to move in ways that you can specify during creation. The most obvious use of a particle system surrounds the portal through which Ghost travels to reach the graveyard. Each little speck of light moving around the portal is an instance of a glowing model I created for this purpose. I use particles in many other ways as well, however. All of the limbo sequence is illustrated with a particle system very similar to the portal to provide a sense of scale for Ghost's movements throughout it. The grass that can be seen throughout the graveyard is also a big particle system tied to the ground, as are the trees that can be seen outside of the graveyard on the surrounding hills. The sparks that float away from the torch held by one of the monster hunters is also a particle system. I considered using particles to place the tombstones, but I decided I needed more control over their placement. Together, these particle systems work to enhance the visual quality of my animation, while reducing some of the work I would otherwise need to do. After I had finished all animation, it was time to begin my next large task, rendering. I had to save all of the frames of my project so they could be placed together into a final film. Normally, this would be a very straightforward process, like saving a document, only much slower. However, I had introduced several complications which required me to forge my own path through the rendering process. Firstly, I still wanted to have Ghost appear visually distinct from the rest of the characters, even though I had to animate her in 3D with the rest of them. To do this, I separated Ghost from the rest of the scene, and used a material called a holdout texture to cover everything besides her. While rendering scenes with Ghost now, I would have a frame that was entirely transparent except for where she was. I also further separated Ghost's eyes from her body. For each frame of animation for Ghost, I would then have 2 layers, one of her body and one of her eyes. I was able to use a photo editing program to then procedurally apply proper, bright colors and outlines to each of these layers, and then combine them together into a final image, with just Ghost, now visually distinct. To tie Ghost into the world though, rather than have it appear as though she was pasted on top, I had a light that matched her location within the scene while she was gone, and lit up portions of the world she was near. This created a problem with the fog I had been using to add depth to the scene, however, as a very clear dot was visible within the fog wherever the light was. And placing Ghost on top of this dot would solve the problem if I didn't intend for her to be slightly transparent. My solution then was to separate the fog from the scene in the same way that I had done for Ghost's body and eyes. As a result, for every frame of animation within the film, I now needed to render 4 separate images. The complications did not stop there, however. For any item that incorporated cloth simulation, there would be a lot of wild stretching resulting from rapid movements in the animation. I used these movements to line up a scene for a character who needed to be framed a specific way in one shot and needed to be framed a completely different way in the next shot. Most of the time, this was used to pull characters in and out of scene during a camera cut and isn't noticeable unless the character has a cloth simulation like Ghost or Ghoul. I didn't have the option of altering these movements this far in production, however, so my solution instead was now to chop each of my 4 rendering layers into separate pieces for each of the necessary camera cuts. This had the benefit of allowing me to speed up render times within certain segments because I could remove elements that wouldn't appear on screen and allow the computer to use its processing power solely for the elements which appeared within the scene. After separating all of the sequences, I now had 47 separate files of animation to render, which resulted in over 16,000 separate images.